I'd like to start out by presenting a couple of basic concepts, and then I'm going to talk about the most famous struggle for water around the world in Cochabamba, Bolivia. Then I'm going to talk briefly about what's going on in South Africa, where the right to water is in their constitution, but what's happening on the ground. Then I'll speak briefly about the United Nations and the right to water and sewage. And finally, I'm going to talk about the struggle here in the United States for the fundamental right for water and for nature, which Kevin mentioned. So first, let's go to the basic concepts. Privatization. This is about water coming under corporate ownership, right? Privatization is about ownership. The second concept is commodification. This is about water being priced by the marketplace. So commodification is about pricing, privatization is about ownership. So there's a very fundamental question, and that is water a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder, or is it a fundamental right for people and nature never to be privatized? Let me just ask you, when did you last buy a bottle of water? Recently? Think about it. When Nestle puts spring water, or Coke or Pepsi put municipal water into a bottle and they sell it to you, they're selling it to you at the market price. The water is now a commodity. You have contributed to the commodification of water every time you buy a bottle of water. The water will be sold to whoever can afford it. And those who can't, that's why we have a cholera epidemic. That's one reason. So when these corporations ship the water to their bottling plants and then ship it to distribution centers and then to retail stores, they've privatized the water and the distribution system for water. Our municipal water systems are public, right? Think Nestle Waters North America. As a nun said to their executive vice president in a meeting I attended, she said, "What makes you think this is your water, Nestle Waters North America? That water belongs only to God." Similarly, when transnational corporations like Suez and Vivendi convince municipalities that they should run the municipal water systems, they privatize the water system, and as we'll see in Cochabamba, sometimes even privatizing the water itself. Now, before we go on, there's one more concept I want to talk about, the word resource. This panel is titled, Creating a Global Economy Based on Sustainable Resources. Resource implies that it's something from which people can profit via the marketplace. If we agree that water should not be privatized or commodified, then we should also agree that water should never be treated as a resource. This is the camel's nose under the tent for the corporate Rio Plus 20 agenda of commodifying all of nature by putting a price on nature and letting the market decide the highest use. So now let's turn to the struggle in Cochabamba, Bolivia. In June of 1997, World Bank officials told Bolivia's president that the $600 million in international debt relief would be dependent on Cochabamba, Bolivia's second largest city, putting its water into corporate hands, and that, quote, no public subsidies should be given to ameliorate the increase in water tariffs in Cochabamba. By the fall of 1999, Bechtel Corporation had created a consortium to privatize Cochabamba's water, asserting ownership even of the rain falling on people's roofs, which they were using for their own personal use. Water rates skyrocketed in the city. By early 2000, people had taken to the streets. Riot police, some trained by the School of Americas, attacked the protesters, killing a 17-year-old boy. But the protesters still knew no fear. They closed down the city. The protest spread to other cities. In the end, the people won. In just 3 months, the Bolivian government gave control to La Coordinadora, the grassroots coalition headed by Oscar Oliveira, who had led the protests. As the World Bank IMF protests in April 2000, at the World Bank IMF protests in April 2000, just down the road from Frederick in D.C., we all protested corporate globalization. Oscar Oliveira spoke, saying, "The people have recaptured their dignity, their capacity to organize themselves, and most often, most important, they are no longer scared." And you know, I've told that story about Cochabamba in more detail many times, and I wonder if I'd have the courage that the people in Cochabamba had. I ask myself, would I have that courage to stand up to the guns? Cochabamba did become a rallying cry around the world, and you can also see the story in documentaries like Thirst and Flow, where Oscar Oliveira is definitely a hero, but I'll also say that behind the scenes, his sister Marcela, who speaks fluent English, brought their struggle to the attention of the international community. And so we have Marcela as well as Oscar to thank for what happened and the movement that began to build. I want to turn very briefly to South Africa. Let me just say that despite the right to water being incorporated into the South African Constitution, by 1994 the ANC had adopted neoliberal policies calling for full cost recovery for water infrastructure and allowing for corporate control of water in poor communities. The people in poor subdivisions outside of Johannesburg had a lock put on their public water tap, so that in order to unlock the tap and get water, they had to prepay for their water. This was done by Suez. Waterborne disease skyrocketed around Johannesburg and around the whole country as these policies were implemented in South Africa. When I was in Johannesburg for Rio Plus 10 in 2002, the South government had the audacity to put up billboards saying water is a human right. At the same time, there were locks on the water taps. We joined a huge protest march. This story has also become an international rallying cry. These stories and many others around the world finally resulted in the United Nations General Assembly passing an historic declaration on July 28th of 2010, declaring there's a fundamental right to water and sanitation. The resolution was introduced by Bolivia's ambassador to the United Nations, Pablo Salon, with whom many of us had worked as a part of the Our World Is Not for Sale coalition against global trade agreements. The vote was 122 in favor, no votes against. There were 41 abstentions. Can you guess who? U.S., Israel, France, Spain, U.S., Canada, Great Britain were 3. Israel was another. Luckily, some of the European countries voted for it. Germany, France, Spain, and Italy all came down on the right side. The United States said the process should have gone forward before the Human Rights Council, not before the General Assembly. And then after it was passed, the Human Rights Council agreed it's okay for private corporations to play a role in assuring the right to water and sanitation. A year later, the International Water Movement were drafting a letter to the United Nations in which we said, quote, "Notably, corporations are shaping the global response to the world water crisis by inserting themselves into the United Nations activities as financiers, collaborators, experts, advisors, and participants. Through these means, transnational corporations have gained unprecedented access and influence over UN activities. At the same time, their activities frequently lead to human rights abuses on a very large scale. Today, the overwhelming focus of international organizations like the UN and the World Bank on partnerships with the private sector is failing to address basic water and sanitation needs, especially in developing countries. Further, these corporate-promoted partnerships overlook the danger of growing corporate control over water, the inadequacy of pay-to-play responses, and the need to strengthen governments in order to ensure proper water governance. So I did a lot of international work, and I began to think that it was time to bring the movement home. It was time to begin working here in the United States, and so I turned my attention to the United States. And I got very interested in rights-based organizing and law. This approach is focused on the corporate actor, not on the regulatory action. It's not about permits. Permits give permission to pollute, just not too much.